Great pleasure to be here because I think what Ekin and I have been doing over the last few years in putting this book together is a very exciting enterprise. It was certainly exciting for Ekin and I to do this work, but I think exciting in terms of what the promise of this particular technique is for the wider profession of economists working in these areas of food safety, food policy, and particularly where I come from, which is more in the environmental economics area. So my role today is to just give some background to where we are in terms of using choice experiments, what choice experiments are, and then to lead into to a description of this particular volume that we're very proud to launch today. Start off with a few basic principles that relate to policy, if I may, and just so that we can establish some common ground, some points of agreement. I think that we'd all agree that it's important for information-based policy to be put into place. I think we can all pretty much agree that it's important for information-based policy to be people-focused. And finally, I think it's important for us to agree that that policy should be transparent in its preparation and delivery. Now, as economists, and I presume that most of us in the room have an economics background, then an important source of information on which to base our policies, which is transparent and is people-focused, is markets. So quite frequently when we're looking at policy instruments, we look to see the effects of those potential policy instruments in terms of actions and reactions through markets. Wonderful things, markets, terrific mechanisms for the transmission of information between parties. But the problem we have in numerous circumstances is that the information that is being transmitted via markets is either inadequate or perhaps even non-existent. And in those circumstances, particularly when the sort of trades that we are witnessing in markets are very thin, we don't have a lot of richness in the data that we're getting out of markets. Perhaps markets are somehow distorted through asymmetric information problems, or perhaps even through government interventions. Or when we're dealing with goods that have very poorly defined property rights that stop trades from taking place in markets, then we have a problem in a failure to access information through markets. What do we do in those circumstances? Well, what we do, at least in this context, is to look to alternative sources of information. And the instrument that we're putting forward today and proposing to you is to look at this new technique or emerging technique called choice experiments as a source of information for transparent, people-based policy. So what are choice experiments? And I'm presuming that most of you have very little knowledge of what a choice experiment is, so I'm going to go back to a very rudimentary explanation. Fundamentally, what a choice experiment does is to ask people to make choices. We provide people with alternatives and ask them to make choices between those alternatives. Those alternatives might range from alternative transport modes, they might relate to alternative health treatments, they might be alternative foods that you want to consume, they might be alternative ways of managing the environment. But choices are provided. The choice options that we give to people, the things that they have to choose between, are described by a sequence of product attributes, characteristics of the choice options that are available to people. And included as one of those attributes is a cost, and a product cost. So we describe alternative options for people to choose between in terms of the characteristics of those options, including the cost to the person who's making the choice. So what we try to do there is to mimic an existing market right, by providing alternatives to people, perhaps mimic or transpose a market so that the distortions are not present, or in fact where there is extreme market failure and there is no market present, then we try to create a hypothetical or a pseudo-market using choice experiments. The choice options that people are given vary according to variances or differences in the levels that the attributes or characteristics can take. So these different options that are provided to people in a choice experiment basically constitute differing levels of these characteristics that the product's described by. And what we do is we try to give people enough choices to cover the full spectrum of opportunities that are available to them. Right, so we try to mix and match all of the different options that are available so that people have a wide variety of choices or a wide variety of options between which they can choose. Then we see how people make their choices. We observe the choices that people make. And by seeing which choice people make from bundles of options, we can see the sorts of trade-offs that they're willing to make. Is a little bit more of this characteristic worth losing a little bit of the other characteristics? So we see the way that people in their choices are making trade-offs between the characteristics that are describing the choice options. And what we can do by looking at the way that they substitute one of these characteristics for another, we can start to see the marginal rates of substitution between these characteristics. And the good thing about that is that if you have one of the characteristics, one of the product characteristics, one of the characteristics that describes these goods as a cost, a monetary variable, then you can start to see the marginal rate of substitution between each of the characteristics, each of these attributes, and money. Right? And that enables us to say, what is the implicit price that people are willing to pay to get a little bit more of the attribute, each of the attributes that describes the product. So in that way, we can start to see, or start to put together the value that people hold for improvements in good attributes, or perhaps the amount they're willing to pay to avoid bad attributes in a product, an attribute that they don't like. Okay, now these choices can be made by consumers, people who are buying products, or they can be made by farmers, by producers who are looking to see what sort of choices they want to make in terms of the mix and match of enterprises that they want to use in their farm. Now, as well as that willingness to pay notion, the sort of marginal value, we can also start to see the way in which we can put together market shares for different products. Okay, if you change the sort of composition of a product, change the characteristics in a product, what does that do to the market share of the product? Does that increase the market share or decrease the market share? So all of these applications are possible. Now, to put this into a bit more of give you a bit of a feel for what a choice experiment involves, this is a sample question that you might put together. And this one is a question that involves natural resource management, NRM. NRM, natural resource management options, which can be described by a number of attributes. Those attributes are listed across the columns. The area of vegetation, the number of species, perhaps there's some consequences, some social consequences. Maybe there are some different employment impacts because of different natural resource management strategies. And there might be some financial consequences to the individual making the choice, so a new tax perhaps. So people are given a choice between three options here. No change, the existing status quo situation, and two other options, two new natural resource management options. So when you're faced with a choice modelling or choice experiment question, this is the sort of question you're asked. Which of these three alternative natural resource management options would you prefer? The status quo, the do nothing new option, or would you prefer one of these other ones? These other ones cost a bit more, so you're going to expect to have to pay a little bit more as a new tax, but you're going to get something in return. You might get a few more new species being introduced. You might be able to perhaps stop some of the job losses that would otherwise be the case. a context that perhaps is more familiar to people working in food policy, you might be asked to choose between alternative products. If you are purchasing this product, would you stick with the old product, which is described in terms of a taste attribute, number of stars you give to the taste? Maybe there's packaging and genetic modification involved here, and alternative prices. So in this case, which product would you choose? Stay with the old one, or would you perhaps like to make a choice of a new product alternative? Now, choice modelling or choice experiments involve these sorts of questions. Not just one of them, but many of these choices. And many of these choices, with each of those choice options being described by differing levels of those characteristics, different sorts of packaging, different existence of GM or not, different prices and different taste combinations, all these different combinations, and we try to see how people make choices to trade off across those characteristics. Now, don't think this is new. Choice experiments have been around for a long time. They've been a long time in the commercial world. Now, if you work for a marketing organisation thinking about whether or not to introduce a new brand or a new product, a new toothpaste or a new breakfast cereal, this is the sort of analysis they do all the time. Right? Change the product characteristics. What sort of market share are we likely to be able to generate from this? What sort of price can we charge for this product? So lots and lots of commercial applications of this technique. Businesses also are keen to see what sort of, or governments I should say, are very keen to see what sort of impact a new regulation would have. If you force the industry to adopt this standard, to adopt this packaging standard, what's going to be the impact of that on product demand? Is it going to shift? Is it going to change something else? It's also been around a long time in transport economics. Transport authorities thinking about whether or not they should change the price of the fares, the metro fares, whether they should introduce introduce air conditioning into the buses or introduce a new form of transport in a route. These are things that the transport economists have been doing for some time. Starting to get a lot more traction now in health economics, the way in which different products might be put together in public or private hospitals. What sort of treatment options should be provided? These are things that choice experiments have been really getting some real traction on. The work that I've been doing mostly over my career has been in the environmental economics field, where this sort of work involves the estimation of non-market valuation, particularly for government policy designed to address environmental concerns, both in the green environmental story, that natural resource management story, but also in the brown environmental economics story, where you've got pollution control mechanisms. What's the benefits and costs associated with alternative pollution control policies? If you don't have a handle on the non-market environmental costs and benefits, you're really in trouble in terms of trying to provide cost-benefit analyses of these policies. And of course, food policy, food safety impacts, genetic modification, different supplementation of vitamin content, etc., can all be investigated by choice experiments. Policy significance, increasing is the key word here. We see around the world now, and I'm talking specifically in developed countries, we see choice experiments getting more and more profile because of the policy significance of non-marketed impacts. EU directives, for instance, in Europe, all require cost-benefit analysis, including non-market valuation. So there's a regulatory imperative to be doing this sort of work. You've got to have those values to be able to put in to your directive assessments. DEFRA in the UK use this stuff now on a regular basis to examine both food issues and nature protection issues. Damage assessment in the US is really one of the heartlands of this sort of work. Presumably we'll see some work of this nature cropping up in the Gulf of Mexico issue, where they're starting to now think about what damage has been caused to the natural ecosystems as a result of the explosion on the BP rig. In my country, Australia, we're seeing more and more by way of the call by finance and treasury officials for things called regulatory impact assessments. So if the government's going to introduce or planning to introduce a new form of regulation, it has to go through the process of being assessed. What impact will that regulation have? What are the costs? What are the benefits? So for the agencies that are specifically tasked with introducing environmental or food safety regulations, they need to be able to do this non-market evaluation, choice experiment type work. I've just been recently doing some fascinating work with the planning authorities in the state of New South Wales, where a new coal mine is being put through the process of a regulatory impact assessment. Right? So what impact is that coal mine going to do to the environment, and what values, what costs are going to be impacted on the community as a result of those environmental costs, to be weighed up against the significant financial returns from mining and selling coal. Next week I'm going to be in Montreal at the World Congress for Environmental and Resource Economics. At that Congress there's going to be a meeting of a club. It's called the IFPRI Club, and this is the Environmental Value Reference Inventory. Okay? And you folk, American taxpayers, help to fund that club. So do I as an Australian taxpayer, so do the British, the French, the New Zealanders, and a host of other developed countries. This is an inventory of value estimates, right, with the idea of providing a repository of value information that can be used in what we call a benefit transfer context. Okay? If you've got a particular policy problem, rather than going out and doing a new study, is there a value having been estimated before that you can learn from? You can take that value and use it as some sort of ballpark estimate of the particular benefit or cost that's of concern to you. I'm probably speaking too long here, Ekin, so I should wrap up. Because what I want to suggest to you, to lead into my colleague Ekin's presentation, is that choice experiments are well and truly established in a range of different fields in the developed world. They've demonstrated a capacity to provide transparent, human-based, people-based information for policy making across a wide range of policy fields. Not to say it's perfect, and from what Ekin will tell you in the next section, a lot of the research that's going on in this field is designed to meet specific research challenges in the developing world. I'd like to suggest to you that there's still an ongoing research thrust in the developed world trying to deal with specific issues. I'm not trying to sell this technique to you as nirvana, right? There's still work being done on this. But what I'm suggesting to you is that it has enormous potential. That potential is being realised now in the developed world. What we need to be doing is to think about what sort of benefits this can provide to the developing world. Now, there are some specific challenges faced by those people researching in this field when applying the technique in the developing world context. All sorts of interesting communication issues. This is not an easy thing to ask people, to ask them about these questions of choice. It's not an easy thing to get across what you as a researcher is trying to achieve. All sorts of different social social contexts that are different in the developing world, that are different from what we've experienced in applying this technique in the developed. Social settings are different. Institutional settings are difficult. Communication problems. All of these things are challenges that face applications of this technique in the developing world. What Ekin and I have been doing over the last little bit, I don't know, how long is it, Ekin, a couple of years, is having a go at trying to do this sort of work in the developing world. And this book that we're launching today is a compilation of some of the studies that have tried to take those challenges on head first.